An American Marine stands on the edge of a jagged cliff, his loudspeaker crackling. He is an interpreter, a Japanese American, and his voice strains with a desperate, pleading urgency. He is speaking in fluent Japanese, not to soldiers, but to families, mothers clutching babies, elderly men, frightened children huddled together. Below him, the turquoise waters of the Pacific churn against the rocks. He tells them the war is over for them. He promises them food, water, safety. He begs them not to listen to the lies they have been told. But they don't listen. A father, dressed in simple civilian clothes, bows solemnly to a group of soldiers, then calmly pushes his wife and child off the 80-foot cliff. He turns and follows them into the abyss. Another family links hands, a small human chain against the sky, and they jump together. A group of teenagers hurl grenades into their own circle. The Marine with the loudspeaker watches, helpless, as hundreds of people choose a terrifying, violent death over the perceived shame of surrender. This is not a battlefield. This is a scene from the end of the world. This was Marpi Point, Saipan, July 1944, and the horror that unfolded on these cliffs was more than just a tragic footnote to a brutal battle. It was a terrifying prophecy. The fight for this tiny, 72-square-mile island was the moment the true nature of the Pacific War's end was revealed. It shattered American assumptions about victory and defeat, and in doing so, it tipped over the first in a chain of historical dominoes. The desperate fanaticism, the shocking civilian deaths, the sheer, unimaginable cost of taking this one island would force a terrible recalculation in Washington. The echoes of the screams from Saipan's cliffs would ripple forward, shaping a strategic decision that would culminate, just 1 year later, in the atomic fires of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is the story of how the battle for a forgotten island became the psychological breaking point of an empire, and wrote the bloody prologue to the nuclear age. By early 1944, the narrative of the Pacific War seemed clear, at least from the American perspective. It was a war of logistics, of industrial might. The United States was a relentless, unstoppable juggernaut, pushing west across the vast ocean. After the shock of Pearl Harbor and the desperate early days, the tide had turned at Midway. The industrial heartland of America was now churning out ships, planes, and tanks at a rate Japan could only dream of. The strategy was a brutal, methodical grind known as island hopping. Take an island, build an airfield, and use it as a stepping stone to the next. It was bloody. It was costly. But the outcome seemed almost a mathematical certainty. The myth was that Japan's defeat was simply a matter of time. But the Japanese High Command had a different narrative in mind. They had drawn a line in the sand, or rather, a line in the ocean. This was the absolute national defense sphere. It was a perimeter of fortified islands that had to be held at all costs. To lose them was to lose the war, and at the very heart of this defensive line lay a small chain of volcanic islands that most Americans had never heard of, the Marianas. And the three most important were Guam, Tinian, and Saipan. These islands were not just strategic dots on a map. They were the keys to Japan's front door. For American war planners, the Marianas represented one thing above all else: airfields. Specifically, airfields for a revolutionary new weapon, a titan of the skies that could change the very fabric of the war, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. This was a bomber unlike any other. It could fly higher, faster, and farther, carrying a payload that dwarfed anything that came before it. From bases in China, The B-29s had proven unreliable and difficult to supply. But from the Marianas, just 1,500 miles from Tokyo, they could unleash a firestorm upon the Japanese home islands. They could systematically dismantle Japan's industry, burn its cities to the ground, and cripple its ability to wage war. The Americans knew they had to take the Marianas. The Japanese knew they had to hold them. This was the collision course. And Saipan, with its relatively flat southern plain and its Japanese-built Aslito airfield, was designated as the primary target. Japan's high command understood the stakes perfectly. They began rushing reinforcements to the island. Among them was a figure whose name was already etched into American history, a ghost from the war's first shocking moments, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. He was the man who had commanded the carrier strike force that attacked Pearl Harbor. Once the celebrated victor, his career had since been a series of defeats and disappointments. Now he was commander of the newly formed Central Pacific Area Fleet, a grand title for a fleet that barely existed. He found himself on Saipan, not as an aggressor, but as a defender, tasked with holding the line against the very nation he had so spectacularly awoken. It was a bitter historical irony. He was joined by the commander of the island's ground forces, the 43rd Division of the Imperial Japanese Army, General Yoshitsugu Saito. Upon Nagumo's arrival, Saito delivered grim news. The island's defenses were a fantasy. They had plans for concrete pillboxes, reinforced bunkers, and vast networks of trenches. But the materials to build them, the cement, the steel, the barbed wire, lay at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, sent there by the torpedoes of American submarines who had been strangling Japan's supply lines for months. The 30,000 Japanese defenders on Saipan would have to make do with what they had: rifles, machine guns, a handful of tanks, and a fanatical devotion to their emperor. They were being asked to stop a hurricane with their bare hands. By early June 1944, that hurricane was gathering force. A massive American fleet, Operation Forager, was steaming towards them. Over 500 ships carrying more than 127,000 men. Among them were battleships that had been resurrected from the mud of Pearl Harbor: the California, the Maryland, the Pennsylvania, the Tennessee, now bristling with guns, seeking vengeance. Aboard the transport ships, Marines from the 2nd and 4th Divisions sharpened their bayonets and cleaned their rifles. They were a world away from home, preparing to fight and die for an island they couldn't place on a map. Aboard one of those ships, a battalion surgeon gave a briefing that perfectly encapsulated the alien and hostile world they were about to enter. He didn't speak of bullets or shells. He spoke of barracudas, sea snakes, razor-sharp coral, poisonous fish, and giant clams that could snap a man's leg like a bear trap. He warned of leprosy, typhus, and dengue fever. He told them not to eat the food, not to drink the water, and to avoid the locals. After painting this grim picture, he asked for questions. A young private, overwhelmed, raised his hand and asked, with all sincerity, "Sir, why don't we just let the Japanese keep the island?" The surgeon didn't have an answer, but history was about to provide one, written in blood and fire. As the fleet sailed on, news crackled over the radios that electrified every man on board. On June 6th, thousands of miles away, Allied forces had landed on the beaches of Normandy. The great crusade to liberate Europe had begun. For a moment, the men in the Pacific felt connected to that larger struggle. But their Normandy was still to come. Their D-Day was scheduled for June 15th. Leading the amphibious assault was Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, a man who had become a master of the complex, violent choreography of landing men on a hostile shore. This would be his fifth major amphibious operation. He knew the playbook. First, you obliterate. Starting on June 11th, carrier aircraft under Admiral Mark Mitcher began to hammer Saipan, destroying over 100 Japanese planes on the ground. 2 days later, Turner's warships arrived and began a naval bombardment of terrifying intensity. For 3 days, the battleships, cruisers, and destroyers pounded the island. From the perspective of the gunners, watching shells the size of automobiles arc towards the shore and detonate in blossoms of earth and smoke, it seemed impossible that anything could survive. It felt like they were sterilizing the island. They were wrong. At 5:42 a.m. on June 15, 1944, Admiral Turner gave the order, "Land the landing force." On board the transport ships, chaplains offered final blessings over the loudspeakers. One concluded his prayer by noting that while most of them would return, some would be meeting their maker that day. An officer standing next to a war correspondent muttered under his breath, "I wish he hadn't said that." More than 700 landing craft, packed shoulder to shoulder with 8 battalions of Marines, churned towards the western coast of Saipan. The final 1,500 yards to the beach was a gauntlet of death. The Japanese, dug into hidden positions the bombardment had failed to destroy, opened up with everything they had. Artillery shells, mortars, and anti-boat guns churned the water into a frenzy. Landing craft exploded. Men screamed. Others sank beneath the waves. But the rest pushed forward because there was no other direction to go. At 8:44 a.m., the first ramp slammed down on the sand of Beach Red 2. The Marines surged out into a storm of machine gun and rifle fire. They kept low, scrambling for any piece of cover they could find. They had reached Saipan. Now they had to survive it. From a 30-foot observation tower just north of the invasion beaches, Admiral Nagumo watched the American Armada. His aide later recalled that the admiral, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was mesmerized, pointing out the resurrected battleships his planes had once sent to the bottom. There was a strange mix of professional admiration and deep unease in his voice. The chickens had come home to roost. As the Marines fought their way off the beaches and into the devastated village of Chalan Kanoa, they expected to find flimsy bamboo huts. Instead, they were met by a maze of sturdy 2-story concrete buildings, many of them now pillboxes in disguise, and a bizarrely out-of-place baseball stadium. Near the center of town, Captain John C. Chapin and his men from G Company paused to fill their canteens. It was a fatal mistake. Mortar shells began to rain down with deadly accuracy. The Marines, focused on the pillboxes in front of them, had failed to notice a tall sugar refinery smokestack in the distance. Perched at its peak was a Japanese spotter, calmly calling in fire coordinates, turning the village square into a killing field. Chapin would later recall the observer caused severe losses before he was finally eliminated. It was a brutal lesson in the opening hours of the battle. On Saipan, death could come from anywhere. Despite the ferocious American assault, General Saito remained confident. His men were holding their ground and inflicting heavy casualties. He believed he could push the invaders back into the sea. He believed reinforcements were on their way. He believed Saipan would never fall. He decided to stake everything on a single, audacious gamble, a nighttime counterattack led by tanks. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 17th, the Marines of the 6th Regiment heard a strange, unnerving sound echoing through the jungle. It was a deep, mechanical rumbling, a clattering and clanking that some men described as sounding like 1,000 kitchen sinks being thrown down a staircase. A warning cry went up through the American lines. "Night attack! Tanks!" Captain Clark Rawlins got on the radio and made a desperate request to the fleet offshore. "Give us illumination!" The response was instantaneous and overwhelming. Navy warships fired salvo after salvo of star shells. The night sky erupted in a brilliant, flickering, artificial daylight, exposing what had been hidden in the darkness. It was Colonel Hideki Guto's 9th Tank Regiment, 44 tanks, lumbering out of the jungle, supported by about 500 infantrymen. Just moments before, Guto had stood upright in the turret of his Type 97 tank, drawn his cavalry saber, and ceremonially struck the side of his vehicle, a signal his other commanders echoed before sealing their hatches for the charge. It was a gesture from another century, a samurai ritual enacted on the eve of a modern, mechanized battle. As soon as the tanks were revealed, the Marines opened fire. A wall of lead and high explosives slammed into the Japanese formation. 37mm anti-tank guns, bazookas, and grenades found their marks. Tanks shuddered to a halt, their tracks blown off. Others burst into flames, their burning hulls casting a hellish glow on the scene and silhouetting the remaining tanks for the American gunners. The attack became a slaughter. One Marine, Private Herbert Hodges, single-handedly destroyed 7 tanks with his bazooka before he ran out of ammunition. Another took out 4, then used a hand grenade to disable a 5th. A 5-inch naval shell from a destroyer offshore hit one tank directly, blowing it into unrecognizable pieces. By daylight, the attack was over. The battlefield was a graveyard of twisted, smoking steel. Colonel Guto was dead. His charge had been a complete and utter failure. But it was also a revelation. This was not a conventional military tactic designed to achieve a strategic objective. This was a suicide charge. It was the moment that shattered the American myth of a predictable logistical war. The first domino had just been tipped. The Marines now understood the nature of the enemy they faced. The Japanese on Saipan were not fighting to win. They were fighting to die. With the failure of Colonel Guto's tank attack, the beachhead on Saipan was finally secured. But it had come at a staggering price. In just over 2 days of fighting, the Americans had suffered nearly 3,500 casualties. The prize, Aslito Airfield, was still in Japanese hands, and the bulk of the island remained a fortress. But for General Saito and Admiral Nagumo, a far more devastating blow was about to fall, one that would come not from the island, but from the sea. Saito and Nagumo were still clinging to a desperate hope that the Imperial Japanese Navy would arrive to save them. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa had sortied with a powerful fleet, his mission to annihilate the American naval forces in the Marianas and land reinforcements on Saipan. It was Japan's last, best hope to turn the tide of the war. On June 19th, Ozawa's fleet engaged Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 in what would become known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The result was a catastrophe for Japan on a scale that defied imagination. American naval aviators, flying superior Hellcat fighters, and backed by advanced radar and experienced commanders, utterly decimated the Japanese air groups. The battle became a massacre, famously nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost 3 aircraft carriers and over 600 aircraft, the vast majority of its remaining carrier air power. Ozawa's crippled fleet limped away in retreat. This naval battle, fought hundreds of miles away, was the strategic death knell for the defenders of Saipan. The door was now locked. No reinforcements would be coming. No supplies would arrive. No evacuation was possible. Every Japanese soldier on the island was now trapped, utterly and completely alone. From this moment forward, they were fighting only for time and for honor. Their war was no longer about survival. It was about the manner of their death. The strategic autopsy was complete. The garrison was doomed. Now began the slow, agonizing process of the tactical meat grinder. With the sea and skies completely under American control, the battle for Saipan's interior began. The island's terrain was a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare. A rugged spine of mountains and ravines, dominated by the 1,554-foot peak of Mount Tapocho, offered countless caves, ridges, and hidden positions. General Saito skillfully used this landscape to bleed the Americans for every inch of ground. The fighting descended into a brutal, close-quarters affair in places that earned grim, fitting names from the Marines who fought there. Hell's Pocket, Death Valley, Purple Heart Ridge. Japanese soldiers would emerge from hidden cave systems to ambush American patrols, then vanish back into the earth. Snipers, concealed in the dense foliage, took a steady toll. The advance became a slow, bloody crawl, measured in yards per day. The Americans brought their overwhelming firepower to bear: naval gunfire, artillery, and airstrikes. But in the twisted terrain, it was often down to the individual Marine or soldier with a rifle, a grenade, or a flamethrower. The immense pressure of the battle also exposed fractures within the American command. Marine General Holland "Howlin' Mad" Smith, commander of all ground forces, grew increasingly frustrated with the perceived slow pace of the Army's 27th Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Ralph Smith. The Marines, known for their aggressive, head-on assault tactics, were advancing up the treacherous slopes of Mount Tapocho, while the 27th Division, fighting in a flat, ravine-filled area they called Death Valley, lagged behind, creating a dangerous gap in the American line. Holland Smith, who already harbored a deep-seated distrust of the Army's fighting ability, saw this as incompetence. In an unprecedented and controversial move, he summarily relieved Ralph Smith of his command. The incident created a firestorm of inter-service rivalry that would rage long after the battle was over, a testament to the brutal strain the fighting placed on everyone involved. By the end of June, the Japanese defense was beginning to crumble under the relentless American pressure. General Saito's headquarters had been pushed back into a cave at the northern tip of the island. His battalions were reduced to mere handfuls of starving men. One captured Japanese soldier told his interrogators that naval gunfire was the most terrifying weapon they faced, the one that broke their morale more than any other. Yet, surrender was never an option. The orders from Tokyo and the Code of Bushido were clear: defend your position to the death. As American forces pushed north, they entered the ruins of Garapan, once a bustling town of 15,000. Now it was a ghost town, its streets littered with the abandoned belongings of a vanished populace. The fighting here was street to street, house to house. The resistance was becoming more desperate, more suicidal. Japanese soldiers would hide in caves, smearing themselves with the blood of their comrades to appear dead, waiting to ambush a passing Marine with a final grenade or sword thrust. In response, the Americans adopted a grim, necessary tactic, bayoneting every enemy body, dead or alive. By the first week of July, the last remnants of the Japanese garrison, perhaps 4,000 able-bodied men, along with thousands of wounded and walking sick, were trapped in a small pocket at the northernmost tip of the island. They had nowhere left to run. General Holland Smith knew what was coming. He predicted the Japanese would stage one final, massive banzai charge, the last convulsive act of a dying army. In his cave headquarters, General Saito knew the end had come. He and his staff ate their final rations. On July 6th, he gave his final order. All remaining Japanese forces, soldiers, sailors, and even some civilians armed with bamboo spears, were to unite for one last attack. His order was not a call to victory, but a poetic summons to death. "I will advance with you to deliver another blow to the American devils," he wrote, "and leave my bones on the soil of Saipan to become a fortress of the Pacific." After issuing the order, Saito and Admiral Nagumo prepared for their own end. They would not lead the charge. Following the samurai tradition, they would take their own lives. In a small cave, the two commanders who had begun the war for Japan in a blaze of glory at Pearl Harbor now ended their lives in darkness and defeat. Attendants shot them in the head to ensure their deaths were swift. Just as Holland Smith predicted, in the pre-dawn hours of July 7th, the final charge began. Somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 Japanese soldiers surged out of the darkness, screaming "Banzai!" directly into the lines of the Army's 101st and 102nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry, the very same 27th Division that Holland Smith had so heavily criticized. A Marine who witnessed the beginning of the attack described it as a sudden eruption of noise, like 1,000 people screaming all at once. It was not a coordinated military assault. It was a human wave, a stampede of men whose only goal was to kill one American before they were killed themselves. They came on relentlessly, a tide of bodies. Many were wounded, limping, or leaning on crutches. They carried rifles, swords, bayonets fixed to bamboo poles, even rocks. The American soldiers were overwhelmed by the sheer scale and ferocity of the attack. Their machine guns and mortars fired until their barrels glowed red and seized up. The Japanese attackers climbed over the bodies of their own dead to get to the American lines. The fighting became a desperate, hand-to-hand struggle in the half-light of dawn. For 15 horrifying hours, the battle raged, but the line, though it bent, did not break. The American soldiers, using everything from 105mm howitzers firing at point-blank range to their rifle butts and bayonets, eventually stemmed the tide. By late afternoon, the charge had spent itself. The Tanapag Plain was covered with the bodies of over 4,300 Japanese soldiers. The largest Banzai attack of the Pacific War was over. The organized resistance on Saipan had ceased to exist. On July 9, 1944, Admiral Turner officially declared Saipan secured. A flag-raising ceremony was held at General Smith's headquarters, but the battle's most terrible ripple effect was yet to be felt. The Americans had won the island. They had crushed the Japanese garrison, but they had not defeated the ideology that drove them. And that ideology would now lead to the battle's final, most gruesome chapter. The first ripple from the fall of Saipan was immediate and strategic. With Saipan, Tinian, and neighboring Guam now in American hands, the B-29 superfortresses had their forward bases. Within months, massive airfields were constructed. By late 1944, fleets of silver bombers were taking off from these islands, flying the 1,500 miles to Japan, and beginning the systematic firebombing campaign that would reduce most of Japan's cities to ash. The key had turned in the lock. The American endgame had begun. But a second, more profound ripple was spreading not through the sky, but through the halls of power in Washington, D.C. Military planners and politicians looked at the butcher's bill for Saipan. To take one small island, the United States had suffered over 14,000 Shan casualties, including nearly 3,500 killed. They looked at the enemy's behavior, the suicidal tank charges, the refusal to surrender even when hopelessly surrounded, and the final horrific Banzai charge. They saw an enemy that did not follow the conventional rules of warfare, an enemy that seemed to prefer annihilation to surrender. Then came the reports of what happened at Marpi Point, now known as Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff. They learned of the hundreds, perhaps thousands of Japanese civilians, men, women, and children, who had killed themselves rather than be captured. They had been victims of a vicious propaganda campaign that told them the Americans were foreign devils who would torture, rape, and murder them. Believing this, they chose what they saw as an honorable death. This civilian tragedy was, for American planners, the most shocking revelation of all. They began to do a terrifying calculation. If the Japanese military and even civilians would fight to this extreme for a distant colonial island, what would they do when the Americans invaded the sacred soil of the home islands? The projected casualty figures for an invasion of Japan were staggering, apocalyptic. Estimates ran as high as 1 million American casualties and tens of millions of Japanese dead. Saipan became Exhibit A in a new, horrifying strategic debate. The fanaticism displayed on that island was now the central variable in planning the end of the war. And that led to the final, history-altering domino. Deep in the deserts of New Mexico, a top-secret project was nearing completion. The Manhattan Project was about to produce a weapon of unimaginable power. Before Saipan, the atomic bomb was a theoretical marvel, a potential war ender. After Saipan, it began to look like a practical, almost necessary alternative. To the men who had to make the decision, including President Harry Truman, the logic became brutal and simple. The choice was no longer between invasion and peace. It was between two horrors. The prolonged, grinding horror of a conventional invasion, which Saipan proved would be a bloodbath on a scale the world had never seen, or the sudden, terrifying horror of a single bomb that might shock the Japanese leadership into a surrender they would otherwise never consider. The memory of those families leaping from the cliffs of Saipan helped justify the decision to drop the bomb. The war that began for America at Pearl Harbor at the hands of Admiral Nagumo would end in a way that he, in his darkest nightmares, could never have conceived. The legacy of Saipan is written across the landscape of the 20th century. It is in the runways of Tinian, from which the Enola Gay took flight. It is in the post-war Japanese constitution and the complex relationship between two former enemies. And it is there today, on the island itself. The caves are quiet now. The beaches are peaceful. Tourists visit the memorials at Suicide Cliff and Bonsai Cliff, standing where those desperate souls made their final choice. The story of Saipan serves as a timeless, brutal lesson. It teaches us about the terrifying power of ideology to drive ordinary people to extraordinary acts of violence, both against their enemies and against themselves. It reminds us that the cold, strategic decisions of war are paid for with a currency of human suffering that is almost impossible to comprehend. The dominoes that began to fall on this small island in 1944 led to the dawn of a new and frightening age. They force us to confront the most difficult question of the war. How does a nation end a conflict against an enemy that refuses to surrender? The story of Saipan offers no easy answers, only a stark and necessary reminder of the true cost of total war and the profound, world-changing consequences that can flow from the battle for one small, forgotten island. The debate over the end of the Pacific War continues to this day. Was the horror of Saipan the key justification for the atomic bomb? Or was there another path? Share your own perspectives in the comments below. And if you believe these complex, challenging stories from our past are essential to understanding our present, please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the history that shaped our world.